There's a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, that comes to every soul, whether in the agony of loss or the stillness of meditation, when a question rises uninvited. If God is truly in control, why does darkness still breathe? It has not arrived dressed in theology. It is not spoken from pulpits or written in sacred ink. It is felt in the hospital room where prayers go unanswered, in the war zones where innocence is shattered, in the midnight thoughts of those who carry wounds the world will never see. We look at evil and suffering as though they are intruders in a world meant for beauty. But what if they're not intruders? What if they are permitted, not celebrated, not desired, but allowed? And if they're allowed, why? This is not an abstract riddle. It is the burning center of the human experience. It is also the question that religion too often answers too quickly, with a verse, a platitude, a whispered God knows best, as if that ever truly satisfied the ache in the soul. I was once told that real faith begins where easy answers end, that the sacred doesn't speak in formulas, but in paradox, and that God, the true God, doesn't flinch at our doubts. He waits for them. He waits because every real question is a door, and the door we avoid most is the one that leads home. This is not a book about Satan. Not really. It is a book about the freedom to fall and the love that does not destroy even when it could. It is about the kind of God who lets evil live, not because he is weak, but because he is something far more dangerous, eternally patient. And it is about you, because every question we ask about the cosmos is, in the end, a question about ourselves. So walk with me, not to find answers that silence the questions, but to deepen them, until they cease being questions and become invitations. We will journey through myths and scriptures, through Persian deserts and sacred texts forgotten by time, through psychology and quantum hints, through Urantia and Upanishads, through the fall of angels and the rising of human consciousness. And when we're done, perhaps the question will remain, but it will no longer haunt you. It will call you. Because the mystery of why God permits evil is not the riddle of a cruel monarch, but the voice of a lover who knows. You can only choose light if you're free to walk through darkness first. It would be simpler, wouldn't it? If the moment Lucifer turned his gaze away from the source, he had been extinguished. If God had drawn a line in the heavens, thundered no further, and crushed the rebellion before it could echo through time. Imagine the centuries spared from war, betrayal, famine, and fear. Imagine a world unfractured by temptation. But that's not the world we know, and that's not the God we're coming to understand. The mystery lies not in the existence of evil. We see that plainly enough, but in its allowance. Why permit the adversary to exist at all? Why give breath to the serpent? Why let the whisper of rebellion trail through generations like smoke curling through Eden's ruin? These are not merely theological puzzles. They're the silent questions buried in every personal ache. The mother who buries her child. The soldier who survives when his brother does not. The child who never feels safe in their own home. All of them, in their own language, ask the same thing. If God is good, why does he allow this? The ancient texts dare to ask it too. The book of Job does not shy away from the horror of divine silence. It presents us with a man shattered by loss, not for his wrongdoing, but to prove a point in a celestial conversation he cannot hear. Job's suffering, permitted by God, is not softened or explained away. The whirlwind speaks, but does not apologize. Herein lies the first fracture in our assumptions. We imagine that power must act immediately, that omnipotence must always manifest as intervention. But what if power, in its highest form, is not control, but restraint? What if God's strength is not proven by eliminating his enemies, but by allowing their freedom, even at great cost. The Urantia Book offers a striking reflection here. It suggests that God's sovereignty is not fragile and thus not threatened by rebellion. In fact, it is because he is secure in his eternal nature that he allows the rebel to live. For only a sovereign unafraid of truth would let lies run their course. And only a creator of true sons and daughters, not puppets, would risk being rejected in order to invite authentic love. We, who measure justice by speed and morality by comfort, find this almost unbearable. We want a God who steps in, who strikes down, who fixes what is broken with divine immediacy. But the cosmos was not built on our impatience. It unfolds by the rhythm of eternal wisdom, and wisdom often waits. The Gnostics, too, wrestled with this. To them, the presence of evil was not merely a moral aberration, but a metaphysical clue that this world, as it is, contains layers of deception. They believed in a divine spark trapped within flesh, seeking to awaken, to remember. The serpent in the garden was both tempter and revealer, not because evil was good, but because truth needed to be chosen, not imposed. And so we come to the unsettling conclusion. God did not destroy Satan not because he couldn't, but because he wouldn't. Because something in the nature of ultimate reality required that evil be seen for what it is, not censored, not silenced, but revealed, endured, and finally transcended. That is divine permission, not as failure or neglect, but as a profound act of cosmic trust. Perhaps the most fragile truth we must carry is this: that a world with evil still permitted is not proof of a God absent, but of a God unafraid. It takes an immeasurable kind of love to allow one's own creation to walk away. And yet, the Father does exactly that, not once but across eternity. There is a deeper courage in divine patience than in divine punishment. We are used to power that dominates, commands, and defends its image. But sacred power, the kind that spins galaxies and weeps with children, does not rush to assert itself. It reveals itself slowly, like morning light through shattered glass. That's why the waiting is holy, and that's why Satan still breathes. The Urantia revelation dares to frame evil not as an equal force to good, but as a temporal distortion, a temporary deviation in the unfolding of experiential time. The rebellion of Lucifer is described not as a cosmic battle between peers, but as a tragic exercise of gifted freedom. Lannon and Deck's sons, endowed with volition and intellect, were meant to help govern the evolutionary spheres. But some, like Lucifer, chose separation, not because they were created deficient, but because the grandeur of freedom includes the risk of self-deception. This nuance is everything. It means God does not rule by coercion, but by the gravitational pull of truth. It means that when the Creator permits the existence of darkness, it is not because he surrenders to it, but because he is confident that light will outlast the shadow. He does not censor falsehood immediately because, in his infinite foresight, he knows that truth must not only be declared, it must be demonstrated. In the book of Job, we witness this demonstration. A faithful servant, stripped of comfort, health, and dignity, becomes the stage upon which the nature of trust is tested. Satan appears not as a terrifying beast, but as a voice of challenge, permitted into the courts of heaven by divine allowance. God does not shrink from the accuser's request. He grants it, not as neglect, but as invitation, because faith that has not been tested remains unproven, and love that has not endured cannot yet be called eternal. So when we ask why God does not destroy evil, we are, perhaps unknowingly, asking why he honors the integrity of our choice. And the answer is not hidden in distant theology. It is written into every breath we take. The freedom to choose love only matters if hate is also an option. The power to seek truth only awakens when deception exists. And the ability to rise only emerges after we've known what it is to fall. There is no contradiction between omnipotence and patience. The one who holds the stars could crush the adversary with a whisper, but to do so would be to shortcut the very thing he came to teach. That truth is not afraid of time, that justice ripens slowly, and that love is most powerful when it is chosen in the face of its opposite. The Gnostic mind, suspicious of the material world, often interpreted it as a prison, a place where divine fragments wander in forgetfulness. And while their cosmology diverged from the more unified vision of Urantia, their ache was familiar. They longed for reunion, for a world without veils. But even the veils, in their own tragic way, teach. They make clear the difference between light and blindness. And they whisper, through symbol and myth, that awakening begins not when the darkness is destroyed, but when it is seen and not chosen. The serpent was not slain in Eden. He was permitted, and even when God cursed him, he did not erase him. Instead, he set a course in motion, one that would stretch through history, through prophets, through deserts, through crosses. The question we must ask is not, why did God let the snake speak? But what does the silence that followed teach us about the voice of God? Perhaps the permission of evil is not an oversight in the divine plan. Perhaps it is the plan, not as its aim, but as its stage. Because in the end, only a love unafraid of being rejected can ever become love that saves. What strikes the soul most deeply is not the presence of evil, but the quietness of heaven in its wake. We cry out not only because the world is broken, but because God, in his mystery, so often does not intervene in the way we would hope. We want fire from heaven, a parted sea, a flood to cleanse the wickedness. But instead, we are given silence, space, and the slow unfolding of consequences, a justice that walks, not runs. But perhaps this slowness is not a flaw in the plan. Perhaps it is the very shape of divine wisdom. Omnipotence does not panic. Eternal wisdom does not rush. God does not act as we do, because he sees what we cannot. He sees beyond the moment. He sees into the seed, and he knows that some truths cannot be imposed. They must be grown. If he destroyed Satan the moment rebellion sparked, what would the rest of creation have learned? That freedom is dangerous? That dissent is intolerable? That power means silencing every deviation? No, the universe would have learned fear, not trust. Obedience, not love. Silence, not wisdom. And what God seeks is not a kingdom of trembling worshipers, but of conscious, radiant beings who choose him. Not by compulsion, but by clarity of soul. The Urantia Book echoes this reality. It reveals a universe not of arbitrary punishments, but of educative justice. A vast architecture of worlds, beings, and systems, where even rebellion becomes, in the long arc of time, a lesson. Lucifer's manifesto, his claim that divine rule was limiting, that personal freedom should override universal harmony, was permitted to spread, not because it held merit, but because its consequences needed to be witnessed. Urantia teaches that the full exposure of error is necessary for the triumph of truth. Without contrast, how could eternal values be chosen with integrity? The Bible is filled with this paradox. God does not shield his prophets from pain. He allows his beloved to wander. He permits his son to be tempted, tried, and crucified, not because he is indifferent, but because truth is forged in the fire of freedom. Even the Christ did not bypass the wilderness. He faced the adversary, not in heavenly glory, but in the fragility of flesh and hunger. And when he emerged, it was not because the devil had been destroyed, but because the Word had endured. Gnostic traditions understood the world as a place of forgetting, a descent from divine fullness into the shadows of separation. But they also believed that the spark remains, that no matter how deep the exile, the divine seed within can still awaken. What is needed is not immediate rescue, but remembrance, not erasure of the darkness, but the birth of light within it. In this way, God's refusal to destroy Satan becomes a mirror. It reflects back to us a startling revelation, that love must allow what it does not approve, that truth must allow the lie, not to endorse it, but to expose it, and that creation, in its most holy movement, is not God controlling outcomes, but God inviting beings to participate in them. This is not the absence of sovereignty. It is its highest expression. Divine permission is not weakness. It is the fierce dignity of a God who does not manipulate his children, who does not rule by force, but by being, who allows even his enemies to breathe, not because he cannot stop them, but because he knows that in the fullness of time, all that is false will collapse under the weight of its own emptiness. And so we return to the question, why does God not destroy Satan? Because he is not finished revealing the truth. There's a kind of strength that does not strike, a kind of wisdom that does not answer, and a kind of love that does not rescue. And it is in that triad, silent strength, waiting wisdom, and long-suffering love, that the mystery of divine permission lives. To destroy Satan would be to remove the question before the soul could answer it. It would be to rob the cosmos of its witness, the witness of contrast, of consequence, of choice freely made. The adversary was not allowed to remain because God failed to see his danger, but because God saw something deeper, that the soul must learn not just what is forbidden, but why it must not be chosen. The voices of ancient mystics echo through this space. From the desert fathers who believed that temptation was the furnace of sanctity, to the Sufis who taught that divine nearness often begins in abandonment, to the sages of the Upanishads who saw duality as illusion and unity as truth. All of them seem to point to the same paradox. The shadow exists, but it is not the end. Even the darkness serves the light. Job never received a clear explanation. He was not told of the celestial dialogue that triggered his unraveling. He was not handed a map through his grief. But when the whirlwind came, it did not offer an excuse. It offered a presence. And somehow that was enough. Not because the pain made sense, but because the silence became sacred. Because even unanswered, he had been seen. Likewise, we do not always understand why evil is allowed to endure. But we begin to see that its permission is not evidence of divine indifference. It is the consequence of a universe that honors freedom even in its misuse, because only through freedom can redemption be real. There are truths so vast that they cannot be told. They must be lived. There are lessons that will not take root through command, only through experience. The Father of all things does not raise children in cages. He lets them walk the world, touch the fire, feel the ache, and then, when they're ready, he welcomes them home, not with rebuke, but with recognition. God does not destroy Satan because that is not how divine authority operates. His is not the kingdom of fear, but of knowing. He knows how the story ends. He knows the rebellion collapses. He knows that every tongue will confess, not by force, but because they will see at last the face of love and fall in reverence, not terror. This is not the story of a war between equals. It is the unfolding of truth in time. It is the long arc of revelation. It is the Father allowing the lie, not to empower it, but but to expose it, so that when all is said and done, the universe will not only praise his name, it will understand why. And that understanding, born of patience, forged in choice, crowned in light, will be the final proof that the permission of evil was never the failure of goodness, but its greatest stage. Before there was a serpent in the garden, there was a song in the heavens, a brilliance unlike any other, a being fashioned not in opposition to light, but as its very reflection. Lucifer, the name itself, means bearer of light. He was not created in darkness. He was born of radiance, sculpted with symmetry, saturated with wisdom. He was, as the ancients say, the morning star, first to rise, last to fade. In many traditions, light is not merely illumination. It is awareness. It is presence. It is that which reveals. And so to bear it is no small task. In the Christian canon, Lucifer is named in echoes. Isaiah speaks of a star fallen from heaven, a figure who once said in his heart, "I will ascend, I will make myself like the Most High." In the book of Urantia, he is not a devil by design, but a Lananindek's son, a high administrative being entrusted with governance, respected for his brilliance, and permitted to carry extraordinary influence within the universe of Nebadon. His fall is not a descent into grotesque evil, but a slow divergence from alignment with truth. That divergence did not begin with hatred. It began with something far more seductive: admiration turned inward. Lucifer, so immersed in the light he carried, began to forget its source. What was once a channel became a container. What was once a mirror became a mask. And in that subtle shift, imperceptible to all but eternity, pride was born. Pride is not the roar of self-exaltation. It is the whisper that says, "I no longer need the one who gave me breath." It disguises itself as independence, as vision, as boldness, but beneath it lies the seed of severance. Beauty, unguarded, becomes vanity. Authority, detached from love, becomes domination. And light, cut off from its origin, becomes shadow. Lucifer's rebellion was not merely moral, it was philosophical. He questioned the very structure of divine administration. Why must all beings submit to his central authority? Why not self-rule, autonomy, a universe governed by reason alone? The Urantia Book describes his so-called Declaration of Liberty, in which he denied the existence of the Universal Father as necessary, promoting instead a vision of individual supremacy and local sovereignty. It was not a scream of rage. It was a manifesto. Cool, logical, poisoned with charm. This is what makes the fall of Lucifer so terrifying. Not that it was monstrous, but that it was convincing. He did not come with horns, but with rhetoric. He did not curse the heavens. He offered an alternative, and 1/3 of the angelic host listened. Traditions across the world tell similar stories. In Islamic cosmology, Iblis was not fallen because of evil, but because of pride. He refused to bow to Adam, believing his own nature, born of smokeless fire, superior to the clay of man. In some interpretations, his fall was framed as a paradox of love distorted. He would bow only to God, and so refuse God's command. The Sufi mystics took this even further, daring to ask, was Iblis condemned for his pride or honored for his love misunderstood? In their daring, they point again to the complexity of rebellion, not as brute defiance, but as love gone blind. In the Vedic traditions, light and shadow are part of the same dance. The Asuras, the demonic beings, were once devas, divine beings who lost their way through ego and desire. Even in Hindu cosmology, the fall is not final. Cycles turn. The soul remembers. The shadow eventually tires of itself. Gnostic mythologies speak of Sophia, divine wisdom, who descended too far in a matter and brought about a kind of rupture. In her descent was sorrow, but also the beginning of creation. Once again, we see a recurring theme. The fall is not always evil in origin. Sometimes it is overreach. Sometimes it is longing. Sometimes it is forgetting. Lucifer's error, then, becomes an archetype. It is not the story of a villain, but the story of every soul who confuses the gift with the giver, the reflection with the flame. He stands not merely as a being of history, but as a mirror to all who have known the seduction of self-worship. The tragedy is not that he was destroyed. The tragedy is that he did not return. And yet, he was permitted to speak, to exist, to persuade, to build his kingdom in shadow. Not because he defeated God, but because God, in perfect sovereignty, allowed the lie to breathe until it collapsed under its own weight. The fall of light is not the end of light, but it is the beginning of understanding. There is a sorrow in the heavens that does not weep, a silence that mourns the lost brilliance of what once shimmered without flaw. Lucifer was not cast out in fury. He walked away clothed in pride, and perhaps that is why his story haunts us still. Not because we fear him, but because we recognize something of ourselves in his descent. To fall is not to become evil. It is to break rhythm with the divine. The fall is not a singular event, but a process, slow, elegant, almost invisible at first. A glance turned inward, a truth questioned, a beauty admired too long in its own mirror. What began as radiance becomes shadow, not by rejection, but by misdirection. Light does not cease to be light because it forgets its source. It dims, it fragments, it seeks itself in its own image and loses the face of the infinite. This is the essence of Lucifer's error, a philosophical seduction. He did not hate God. He simply believed he no longer needed him. He saw in himself the spark and mistook it for the flame. His brilliance became self-referential. The energy that once flowed became static, still shining, but no longer illuminating. The Urantia Book makes this painfully clear. Lucifer's rebellion was not born from rage or ignorance. It came from brilliance unbalanced by humility. It was a philosophical crisis disguised as enlightenment. His critique of divine sovereignty was not irrational. It was dangerously reasonable. And in that reason, stripped of reverence, he planted the seeds of systemic distortion. A being created to govern with divine trust began to advocate for the dissolution of that very trust, replacing it with the gospel of self. This makes the rebellion all the more tragic and all the more relevant, because this is not merely a story of angels and ancient stars. It is the architecture of every human delusion. Every age has had its Lucifers, thinkers and dreamers who saw the beauty of creation and believed they could remake it in their own image. Every ego that confuses independence with transcendence walks the same path, not toward liberation, but isolation. And yet, the fall is never without invitation. The door to return remains, even if unentered. Lucifer's freedom was not revoked. His existence was not annihilated. He was allowed to continue, not as endorsement, but as exposure, not as divine failure, but as divine fidelity to freedom. The mythologies surrounding the fall of light reflect a deep human awareness that rebellion is not always grotesque. Sometimes it is exquisite. Sometimes it wears a crown. The Greeks told of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods, not to destroy, but to enlighten. His punishment was eternal, but so was his legacy. In this, too, we see the duality of the fall, illumination and arrogance bound in the same act. Is he hero or heretic? The question is never simple. What matters is not the fall, but what follows. To fall in love with one's own light is to forget that light, by its nature, is given. It is not owned. It is passed through. A vessel cannot become the source without distorting both itself and what flows through it. And this distortion, once embraced, becomes systemic. In Urantia, Lucifer's rebellion was joined by Satan, his associate, and later by Caligastia, the planetary prince of Earth. Their alliance was not forged in rage, but in ideology. They saw themselves as revolutionaries, not traitors. They believed they were freeing the universes from tyranny. This is how evil often enters, not as chaos, but as order untethered from truth. The rebellion spread not because it was violent, but because it was persuasive. It offered what seemed noble: autonomy, enlightenment, freedom. But it stripped those virtues of their alignment with the divine. And like a star that burns too hot, it collapsed into itself. Lucifer's fall is not a cautionary tale meant to frighten children. It is a mirror held before the soul. The one who carried light fell, not because he was weak, but because he mistook his radiance for divinity. The lesson is not that beauty corrupts, but that beauty without surrender leads to ruin. What makes the story sacred is not the punishment, but the permission. God did not crush the rebel. He let him speak, let him build, let him rule for a season. Because the truth that silences a lie is not always spoken. Sometimes it is lived. There is an ache woven into the fabric of the cosmos, a quiet tension that echoes the memory of a light that turned inward. The fall of Lucifer is not merely an ancient myth. It is a cosmic sigh, the consequence of a love that refused to bend, a brilliance that refused to bow. It reminds us that rebellion begins not with hatred, but with subtle deviation, not with the rejection of good, but with its redefinition. In the Urantia Book, this distortion is framed not as criminal, but as misguided. Lucifer's manifesto challenged the existence of the universal Father, calling divine loyalty slavery and personal sovereignty salvation. But what he failed to understand is that freedom severed from truth does not elevate the soul, it isolates it. In seeking autonomy, he lost communion. In rejecting divine order, he unthreaded himself from the harmony of the universe. And this, perhaps, is the most sobering revelation, that evil does not need to rage to be real. Sometimes it only needs to forget. The true horror of the rebellion was not fire or fury. It was ideology. It was the repackaging of divine truth into palatable half-lies. It was not an explosion. It was a drift. And in that drift, stars dimmed, systems fractured, and whole worlds entered confusion. Yet through all of this, the Creator did not destroy. He waited, because in the divine heart, even the fallen are not forgotten. Even the rebels are still sons. This is not to romanticize evil, nor to excuse the pain it brings, but to glimpse the staggering breadth of divine love. A love that permits the shadow to exist, not as rival, but as contrast, not as equal, but as foil, so that when the light returns, it does so not by command, but by conviction. The archetype of the fall appears across cultures for a reason. It touches something fundamental in us, the deep awareness that we, too, carry light, and that we, too, can misuse it. The Greek myth of Helios warns of the sun chariot driven recklessly. The Tibetan stories speak of luminous beings forgetting their origin and descending into form. The Kabbalists speak of shattered vessels, where divine light was scattered into fragments, waiting to be gathered again through conscious acts of restoration. These stories, scattered across time and space, are not merely tales of others. They are confessions, warnings, invitations. We all have our own rebellions, our own moments of forgetting. Our own Lucifer hidden in the folds of ego, whispering that we deserve more, that we are enough without the source, that the mirror is the origin. And yet, always, there's a return. But Lucifer did not return. That is the wound that remains open in the architecture of the universe. Not because God refuses to heal it, but because the rebel refuses to be healed. This is the tragedy behind the tale. Not the fall itself, but the refusal to rise again. Pride that calcifies into identity. Freedom that curdles into separation. Brilliance that chooses exile. And still, the door remains open. The cosmos watches, not in fear, but in mourning. Not in helplessness, but in hope. For if even the bearer of light could find his way back, what song might be sung across the galaxies? The rebellion of Lucifer was not the triumph of darkness. It was the exposure of a fault line that runs through every created will. The capacity to choose the self over the whole. And God, in his terrifying mercy, allowed it. Not because he needed to, but because he trusted that, in the end, truth would prove itself more powerful than persuasion. That love would outlive ideology. That time, patient and silent, would reveal what argument cannot. Lucifer fell because he could. He remained fallen because he would not return. And in that choice, the universe began to understand that the brightest light, once turned against its source, casts the deepest shadow. The most daring gift God ever gave was the one that could be used to walk away from him. In a universe governed by light, symmetry, and unspeakable order, the existence of free will is the most unpredictable element. It is the holy gamble, the divine risk, not because God is uncertain of the outcome, but because he chooses not to control the path. And in that single decision, to allow beings to choose, a drama was born that stretches across time and space, touching stars and dust alike. Free will is not chaos. It is not rebellion waiting to happen. It is sacred potential, the power to align with the source not because of force, but because of revelation. And yet, in the hands of conscious beings, it is more than a mechanism. It is a mirror. In it, the soul sees what it values most, where it bends, and who it becomes. The Urantia Book describes the divine administration as a reality sustained by trust, not imposed obedience. The Universal Father, it says, does not demand love. He invites it. An invitation, by its nature, can be refused. That refusal is not punished with thunder. It is permitted, not because it is good, but because real love can only arise when refusal is possible. Without the shadow of rejection, light has no depth. This is the unbearable beauty of creation, that God, in all his power, chose not to make puppets, but participants. In the Hindu vision of Lila, the universe itself is a divine play, not a deterministic script, but spontaneous unfolding where Brahman, the ultimate reality, chooses to forget itself in form, only to remember again through experience. In this cosmic game, each soul is both actor and witness, both veiled and luminous. The play is not pointless. It is purposeful. It is how the infinite learns its own reflection through the finite. And yet the game is not rigged. The soul is not forced to return. It may wander, circle, fall, rise, sleep again. And this is what makes the journey sacred. Because if God simply snapped his fingers to align every being with his will, there would be order, but not beauty. There would be compliance, but not communion. What he desires is not performance, but presence. Not automation, but awareness. The mystics of Sufism speak of this same longing. They speak of a lover who hides himself not to punish, but to be sought. In the burning heart of Rumi's poetry is a God who allows distance not out of cruelty, but out of devotion, for the soul must taste longing to recognize reunion. The beloved, they say, knocks on the soul from within, but the door can only be opened from our side. This is the paradox of divine sovereignty, that the one who holds all things does not hold them too tightly. He rules, but he does not restrain. His power is not displayed in domination, but in trust. He lets us choose, even when our choices break his heart. And what could be more divine than that? The great Vedantic sages understood this too. They taught that the self, the Atman, is ultimately one with Brahman, the supreme reality. But this oneness must be realized through awakening, not decree. Even if the soul is never truly separate, it must feel separation to seek return. Maya, the illusion, is not merely deception. It is the veil that makes reunion meaningful. If there were no forgetting, remembering would have no joy. In this light, control is no longer the highest virtue. Sovereignty is, and sovereignty, unlike control, does not need to overpower. It only needs to be. God is sovereign not because he forces all things into place, but because all things eventually find their way back to him. Even when they flee, they do not leave his reality. They only delay their own peace. There is a sacred violence in freedom, not the kind that wounds, but the kind that refuses to manipulate. It is the quiet assertion of a God who says, "I will not make you love me." And in that refusal to force, something radical emerges, a love that means something because it could have been denied. This is why love, in its purest form, must be chosen. Anything less is not love, but obedience without spirit. In the theater of the cosmos, the script is unwritten not because God is unprepared, but because he prefers a story that breathes. He prefers a lover who turns freely toward him, even after wandering, even after doubting, even after tasting every lesser light. He is not the playwright who demands applause. He is the beloved who waits quietly until the soul realizes that every other voice was an echo of his own. The Urantia Book affirms that God's sovereignty is not threatened by rejection. That which is truly sovereign does not fear defiance. It absorbs it, outlasts it, and in time, reveals it to be dust beside the glory of truth. And so, instead of overruling the will of his creatures, God surrounds them with the consequences of their choices, not to punish, but to illuminate. The pain is not imposed. It is permitted because what is learned through pain may become the ground of wisdom. The Father governs not through force, but through the dignity of cause and effect. This dignity is precisely what marks the difference between control and sovereignty. Control demands conformity. Sovereignty invites alignment. Control manipulates outcomes. Sovereignty trusts the journey. Control sees freedom as a threat. Sovereignty sees it as the crown of creation. And that is why, even when Lucifer turned against the source did not retract the gift of will. To do so would have undone the very meaning of love and the whole point of existence. The Sufis whisper that God is closer to us than our own breath, and yet he remains hidden until we choose to see. This divine concealment is not absence. It is invitation. The lover hides, not to torture the seeker, but to awaken longing. For what is found too easily is often forgotten, but what is sought through fire becomes sacred. Rumi spoke of this longing as the flame that burns away illusion. He saw the beloved not in the temples of power, but in the trembling heart that had lost everything and still said yes. That is what God longs for, not worship offered under compulsion, but love spoken in the dark, when nothing compels it but truth alone. Vedanta teaches that the soul, though always one with the divine, forgets its unity in order to rediscover it with eyes that can finally see. The illusion of separation is not cruelty, it is the context of awakening. Just as the seed must break to sprout, the soul must pass through darkness to remember light. And in that breaking, in that passage, the will becomes holy. Free will is not a flaw in the system. It is the key to everything. It is the reason creation sings. Because if beings could not choose, then no music would matter. No forgiveness would astonish. No sacrifice would shine. It is the possibility of rejection that makes acceptance divine. It is the silence of God that makes his voice unmistakable when heard. And so, we live in a universe where even angels may fall, where even darkness is allowed to speak, not because God lacks power, but because he honors it too deeply to use it against us. He does not shatter the heart to win it. He waits outside its door, knowing that the one who opens it freely will never again wish to close it. This is sovereignty, not the crushing of all that opposes, but the quiet confidence that all will return, not by decree, but by love, not in fear, but in freedom. If the soul is a vessel, then freedom is the space within it, the vastness where the divine may enter, not uninvited, but longed for. It is this openness that gives meaning to everything else. Without freedom, obedience is empty. Without freedom, truth is hollow. Without freedom, love is not love, only performance. It is not accidental that the story of humanity begins with a choice. A garden, a tree, a voice that tempts, and a silence that permits. No lightning strikes, no divine hand intervenes, only the possibility and the freedom to say yes or no. This is not negligence. It is sacred risk. And from that risk, every tear and every redemption finds its origin. The Urantia Book speaks of mortal ascension as the progressive alignment of the self with divine reality, a long arc of transformation where the will of the creature learns, through trial and wonder, to harmonize with the will of the Creator. But this harmonization cannot be programmed. It must be discovered. It must be chosen over and over again, in shadow and in light, in clarity and in confusion. The very process of perfection requires that imperfection be possible. This is why the greatest power God ever exercised was restraint. The Creator of all things allows himself to be refused, ignored, misunderstood. He permits not only the fall of angels, but the silence of prophets, the exile of sages, the death of his own Son. Not because he is powerless, but because he is love, and love cannot coerce. It can only reveal. All the wisdom traditions, in their own way, whisper this same truth. The Buddhists speak of the awakened one not as a savior who demands worship, but as one who sees reality clearly and invites others to do the same. The Taoist does not conquer the current, but moves with it, knowing that what yields is often stronger than what resists. Even the silence of the Zen master, striking the disciple with a wordless glance, points to the same paradox. Nothing is truly received unless it is freely grasped. And so we are left in a world where pain is possible, not because God is absent, but because God refuses to violate the soul's becoming. He honors the process. He dignifies the journey. He lets the play unfold, not as spectator, but as presence, hidden within every scene, waiting for the moment when the actor remembers the script was never meant to bind, only to liberate. To some, this is madness. Why permit the brokenness? Why allow the risk of rebellion? Why give such power to those so prone to forget? But the answer, if it can be called that, is as simple as it is vast, because a forced paradise is no paradise at all, because a kingdom without consent is not the kingdom of heaven. It is only a prison with golden walls. And so God waits. He waits through the rise and fall of empires, through the silence of prayers unanswered, through the defiance of the very creatures he formed in light. He waits not because he is bound by time, but because he respects the timing of the soul. He waits because he knows that when the heart is ready, even a whisper will become thunder. Even a glance will become home. This is the theater of free will, not a stage of chaos, but of choreography, where every step, even the missteps, can be redeemed, where every character, even the lost, has a path back, where the curtain never falls without the invitation of return. The story of the soul is not written by force. It is sung in freedom, and the one who listens waits, not to judge, but to join in harmony, not to seize, but to receive, because in the end, sovereignty does not dominate. It welcomes. What if the very thing we most fear is the thing that most reveals us? Evil, that ancient riddle, has never ceased to haunt human consciousness. We name it, flee it, fight it, theologize it, and yet it persists, not as anomaly, but as mirror, not as final adversary, but as unyielding invitation to see what lies beneath our luminous masks. In the Hebrew Scriptures, the word Satan did not initially refer to a being of pure malice, but to an adversary, a force that obstructs, resists, questions. The Satan was the one who stood in the way, who provoked examination, who opposed not out of chaos, but out of challenge. In this light, the adversary becomes not simply an enemy, but a necessary tension within the evolution of the soul. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that we do not grow in the absence of resistance. We grow because of it. The athlete becomes strong not by rest, but by pressure. The seed does not rise except through darkness, and the spirit does not awaken through comfort, but through friction. What opposes us is often what defines us, and what we call evil may, in the greater mystery, be the weight that gives shape to our wings. In the book of Urantia, the presence of evil is not viewed as the triumph of darkness, but as a temporary dissonance in the great music of the cosmos, a necessary space in which moral and spiritual growth may occur. The soul, placed in a universe where choice is real, cannot become wise unless confronted by falsehood. There can be no courage without fear, no loyalty without betrayal, no faith without doubt. In the grand architecture of experiential evolution, evil becomes not an end, but a condition of development. A hard teacher, but a teacher still. Carl Jung dared to speak of the shadow, not as enemy to be exiled, but as a part of the self that must be integrated. He saw in the rejected, unloved parts of the psyche the roots of both darkness and transformation. Evil in this vision is not only external, it is internal. And the refusal to see it only strengthens its grip. What is denied becomes what controls. What is repressed becomes what possesses. The shadow is not the monster beneath the bed. It is the unacknowledged within. And it is only by facing it, honestly, fiercely, with compassion but without illusion, that the soul becomes whole. Jung knew what the mystics have always known, that light without shadow is not enlightenment, but delusion. And Viktor Frankl, survivor of the darkest systems of human cruelty, spoke not of despair, but of meaning. He did not excuse evil. He faced it, and in facing it, he uncovered a startling possibility, that suffering, when chosen consciously, becomes the raw material of transcendence. That even in the concentration camp, the soul could choose dignity. That even when everything is taken, the one true freedom remains to choose how we respond. This, perhaps, is the deepest alchemy, not turning lead into gold, but turning pain into purpose. If God wished to create obedient servants, he would have made a universe without opposition. If the divine intent were merely to be obeyed, there would be no need for suffering, no risk of rebellion, no descent into shadow. But this is not the world we find ourselves in. And perhaps the very structure of our reality reveals something God values more than ease: awakening. The adversary, whether encountered as a being, a circumstance, or a voice within, does not simply oppose. He activates, he pressures, he reveals. Like the heat that draws impurities from gold, evil forces us to decide what we are made of. It strips us of the illusion that goodness is passive. It demands that we choose, not once but continually, not in theory but in fire. There are no saints forged in comfort. The truly luminous ones, the mystics, the healers, the silent martyrs, they have all passed through the crucible. Not because pain ennobles in itself, but because what is revealed in pain cannot be revealed in ease. Evil, in this way, is the question that refuses to let us remain asleep. It is the teacher that arrives without invitation, the harsh mentor who cares nothing for our convenience, but everything for our potential. In the Jewish mystical tradition, the concept of Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, is not entirely condemned. It is seen as a force to be disciplined, yes, but also as the source of energy, drive, desire. Without it, one could not marry, build, strive, create. It must be mastered, not eradicated. This vision does not glorify the dark, but neither does it pretend we grow without wrestling it. And what is wrestling, if not the sacred art of resistance? Jacob did not become Israel until he wrestled through the night with a stranger, until he was wounded, until he refused to let go. He left that encounter limping and transformed. So too the soul, when it stops running from its adversary and instead dares to face it in truth. This is not a romanticization of evil. Evil destroys. It wounds. It lies. It enslaves. But if permitted to do its work, not unchecked, but observed, it also unmasks. It shows us where we are weak, where we are proud, where we are asleep. It forces us to ask who we really are when the lights go out, when the temple falls, when the promise dies. And in those places of devastation, if we do not turn bitter, we can begin to turn real. The path of transmutation is not denial. It is confrontation with reverence. To look into the eyes of the shadow and say, I see you. You are not my guide, but you are my mirror. And in your distortion, I begin to remember what is true. This is the alchemy of the soul, not perfection without error, but gold born from the crucible. The Urantia Book calls Earth a decimal planet, an experimental world where evolutionary potentials are tested in more vivid contrast. Is it any wonder, then, that here, in this crucible of paradox and pain, the lessons are sharper? That evil is not just theoretical, but embodied, global, ancestral? That the wounds we carry are not only ours, but written into the very design of a world meant to learn by living? The enemy, then, is not merely the one who seeks our destruction. It is the one who forces our definition. Satan is the necessary foil, not because he is good, but because the good must be chosen in contrast to what denies it. He is the obstacle placed not in cruelty, but as part of the curriculum of consciousness. Not because God delights in evil, but because God trusts us enough to face it. And in facing it, we begin to see that the greatest power we possess is not purity, but persistence. Not moral superiority, but the willingness to rise again and again, after every fall, after every darkness, after every lie, to rise, not with certainty, but with eyes open, and hearts broken, and wills that have discovered their true shape not in ease, but in fire. We often imagine that the spiritual life is a movement away from darkness, a flight into the pure, the serene, the untouched. But every sacred path, in its deepest current, moves not around a shadow, but through it, not to glorify it, but to disarm it, not to celebrate it, but to reclaim what was buried beneath its weight. Evil teaches, but it teaches by contrast. It is not the voice of wisdom, but the silence that surrounds it. It is the storm that makes stillness holy. It is the wound that makes healing visible. And in this paradox, the soul learns that true vision is not the ability to avoid suffering, but the grace to see through it. Those who have suffered and come out the other side, not unscarred, but unbroken, often speak of a strange clarity. They say they no longer fear what they once did. They say they met themselves in the ruin, and what they found was not a monster, but a child, not a failure, but a beginning, because sometimes it takes darkness to see what light is. The adversary, in this way, becomes a servant, unwilling, unaware, and yet indispensable. He forces the confrontation we spend our lives avoiding. He pulls away the comforts that numb. He dismantles the certainties that lull. He makes the question impossible to escape. What is real in me? What endures when everything else fails? And this is why evil, though never holy, becomes part of the sacred, because it pushes the soul toward what cannot be shaken. It exposes every illusion until only essence remains. It takes us to the edge of the self, and then, in that raw and trembling space, something ancient and eternal speaks. Not in fury, not in fear, but in fire, in whisper, in light that no shadow can name. And what it says is not a command, but a calling. Not a rebuke, but a remembrance. You are not the wound. You are not the failure. You're the one who passed through, the one who stood when others fled, the one who looked at the serpent and did not run. This is how evil fails, not by being destroyed, but by being revealed, by losing its disguise, by having its power turned inside out and made into fuel for a deeper love, a fiercer courage, a wiser will. The soul that has suffered consciously does not become bitter. It becomes luminous because it knows what it costs to love, and it loves anyway, not because it forgot the fire, but because it walked through it and emerged, not pure, but real. Not all who dwell in darkness are equal, and not all who fell did so in the same way. The cosmos is not divided into simple binaries, good above, evil below, but layered, intricate, intelligent in its descent. There are many kinds of fall. Some are sudden, others are gradual. Some come from pride, others from sorrow. And between heavens and hells, a kingdom emerged, not of sovereignty, but of fragmentation, a realm of the fallen. When we speak of fallen angels, we often imagine chaos, winged beings cast down in rage, rebelling in thunder and flame. But the truth is more nuanced and more unsettling. In the ancient accounts, there are hierarchies even among the exiled, orders, intentions, agendas. Not every darkness is the same. Not every rebel serves the same cause. Some seek destruction, others seek to rule. Some simply seek escape from the unbearable light. In the Urantia Book, a distinction is made between the rebel administrators, such as Lucifer and his followers, and what we might call disembodied spirits or traditional demons. The former were once entrusted with positions of cosmic responsibility. They governed systems. They made decisions affecting entire worlds. Their fall was ideological, a conscious defiance of divine administration. They are not mindless nor chaotic. They are structured, strategic, dangerous not only for their power, but for their rhetoric. Then there are the entities whose nature is less defined, spirits that roam, whisper, disturb. Jesus encounters them in the Gospels. Unclean spirits, desperate for a body to inhabit, begging to be cast into swine rather than return to the abyss. These are not the same as the rebel sons of heaven. These are something else. Lost, disconnected, parasitic, and yet still permitted to exist. Were they? The Urantia Book is careful not to conflate categories. These beings are not fallen celestial administrators, but may be remnants of distorted personalities, confused fragments of identity, or spiritual residue from worlds and epochs long past. Their presence reminds us that the spiritual realm is not empty space. It is populated, dynamic, and sometimes tormented. The Kabbalah speaks of Cliffith, the husks, the shells of what once carried divine energy, now hollow and inverted. These are not beings of origin, but of aftermath, spiritual echoes twisted by disconnection from source. In Kabbalistic cosmology, the fall is not simply downward. It is inward, a contraction of divine light into opacity. The deeper the fall, the less resemblance to light remains. But even the husks are not beyond redemption. Sparks can still be recovered. Light, trapped within darkness, can still be drawn out by conscious intent. In the mystical streams of Islam, particularly in Sufism, Iblis, the Islamic parallel to Lucifer, is a figure of immense tension. He refuses to bow to Adam, not out of hatred for God, but out of unbending loyalty to him. "You created me from fire," he says, "and him from clay." To some mystics, Iblis is not a villain, but a misunderstood devotee, whose fall arises not from evil, but from a love so proud it becomes blind. This does not absolve him. It complicates him. It reveals that the line between rebellion and devotion is not always clear. That pride can wear the robes of reverence. Christianity, especially in its Easter traditions, speaks of the abyss not as a place, but as a condition, a state of being cut off from divine communion. The Orthodox vision is not obsessed with punishment, but with healing. Even hell is described not as a burning torment inflicted from without, but as the inner consequence of rejecting divine love. God, in this view, is always shining. It is the soul that turns away, and in doing so, creates its own darkness. The abyss is not merely a destination. It is a condition of distance, not spatial, but relational. It is not below in any geographical sense, but rather apart, a severing from the divine harmony that gives everything its meaning. Those who dwell in it are not simply punished. They are disconnected. Their torment is not fire, but fracture, not isolation from each other, but from origin. This is why so many mystics speak not of hell as a place of divine vengeance, but of existential exile. To be in hell is to remember light while being unable to feel it. It is to know the source and yet be out of tune with it, by choice, by pride, by inertia. In this state, even divine love burns, not because it has changed, but because the soul has. The Urantia Book approaches this reality with particular precision. The Lucifer rebellion, as it unfolded in Jerusalem, the capital of our local system, was not an uprising of violence, but of ideology. Lucifer argued for liberty from the rule of the Universal Father and from the coordinated administration of the Paradise hierarchy. His manifesto was subtle, appealing, seductive. It promised freedom, autonomy, self-determination. But beneath these words was the root poison of separation. Those who aligned with Lucifer, including Satan and others, did not become demonic in appearance. They remained brilliant beings of spiritual stature, but they became distorted in purpose. Their light was no longer directed outward toward divine service, but inward, into a recursive loop of self-reference. They ceased to reflect and began to absorb. And the more they absorbed, the darker they became, not in radiance, but in resonance. Demons, in contrast, are not part of that high rebellion. They are of another order. Many are confused, broken spirits, remnants of individual identities shattered by trauma, addiction, hatred, or spiritual amnesia. They are not powerful in the cosmic sense, but they are persistent. They cling, they whisper, they feed on resonance. And the resonance they seek is fear, chaos, despair. Because those vibrations give them a sense of place, a taste of coherence in their otherwise formless state. This is why possession, both literal and metaphorical, has always been seen as more than a horror trope. It is the soul's surrender to a frequency not aligned with its essence. It begins with bitterness, with rage unspoken, with wounds left to rot, and it ends in fragmentation, when the self no longer knows which voice is its own. But healing is always possible, for the soul is never fully lost unless it chooses to be. In Orthodox Christianity, the path of healing is not through condemnation, but through illumination. The soul is guided back not by fear of hell, but by love for what is real. Icons, fasting, prayer, silence. These are not superstitions, but disciplines that realign the soul with its origin. The abyss is not destroyed. It is transfigured. It becomes the place where humility is born. Likewise, in the Kabbalistic tradition, the work of the righteous, the tzaddikim, includes the task of raising fallen sparks. Even in the lowest realms, shards of divine intention remain, waiting for a consciousness bold enough to retrieve them. Evil, in this view, is not absolute. It is exile, and exile, though bitter, implies return. The fallen realm is thus not final. It is a stage, agonizing, complex, mysterious, in the great arc of redemption. For every soul that chooses to rise, another bridge is built between the broken and the whole, between the forgotten and the remembered, between the echo and the voice. And perhaps this is the deeper truth, that even among the fallen, the memory of heaven endures. Dim, distorted, buried, but there, a flicker, a hunger, a song not yet fully silenced. And that, in the end, may be what undoes the abyss. Not wrath, but remembrance. Not force, but mercy. Not victory, but return. There is a silence more deafening than thunder, a stillness more disturbing than chaos. It is the silence of God, not in absence, but in restraint, not in indifference, but in something far harder to accept, patience. We ask over and over, where is the divine hand when injustice prevails? Where is the fire that once consumed Sodom, the flood that once purified the world, the voice that thundered from Sinai? Why, in the face of evil so blatant, does the heavens seem quiet? This is not a new ache. The psalmist wept it. How long, O Lord, will you hide your face? Job cursed the day of his birth under the weight of unanswered suffering. Even Christ on the cross cried, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" This is not weakness. It is the agony of the finite standing before the eternal and not understanding why the light delays. But perhaps what we call delay is design. And what we perceive as divine in action is the unfolding of a wisdom so vast it cannot yet be born. In the Urantia Book, justice is not instant, because time is the canvas upon which revelation unfolds. The rebels are not destroyed because their path must be seen to the end, not for the sake of the Father, but for the education of the universe. Truth must be chosen, not imposed, and the lies of rebellion must be exhausted, exposed, and rendered powerless not by decree, but by self-collapse. To judge prematurely is to rob others of the clarity born from full contrast. The harvest is not reaped in spring, no matter how eager the heart may be. The Master said it clearly, "Let the wheat and the weeds grow together until the time of harvest." Because judgment that heals must include understanding, and understanding takes time. This is the rhythm of spiritual justice, not immediate reaction, but cosmic exposure, a divine letting be, not to endorse the false, but to allow its nature to reveal itself, to ripen, to decay, to be seen. In this way, judgment becomes not an act of wrath, but a moment of unveiling. The masks fall, not by force, but because they can no longer hold. And here lies the paradox. What we see as permissiveness is mercy. What we mistake for abandonment is trust. The Creator does not interrupt every lie, every betrayal, every cruelty, not because he is asleep, but because he is allowing the story to finish its own sentence. The final period must come from within. Justice in the divine mind is not merely the correction of wrong. It is the restoration of wholeness. It is not about satisfying anger, but about healing what was broken without reproducing the fracture. In this, it differs radically from human justice, which so often seeks equilibrium through retribution. The divine path is not to mirror evil with punishment, but to transmute it into understanding. The waiting, then, is not negligence. It is the womb of clarity. Every unpunished injustice, every unchecked cruelty, every tyrant left standing. They serve not to diminish divine love, but to give the universe time to see what love would never force it to believe. Revelation is not lightning. It is sunrise. It comes not to blind, but to illuminate. And light, to be received, must come when eyes are ready. In this, the silence of God becomes an instrument, not of distance, but of education. It allows human freedom to express itself fully, not because God agrees, but because love without freedom is theater, not transformation. To intervene too soon would be to abort the evolution of conscience. To judge prematurely would leave the soul unawakened. And so the Father waits, and in the waiting reveals. Jesus, in the gospel narratives, often delays his answers. He walks slowly to the tomb of Lazarus, allowing grief to unfold. He remains silent before Pilate, allowing the system to expose itself. He refuses to call down angels during his arrest, allowing betrayal to show its full face. Each moment of inaction is a mirror held to the world, not to condemn it, but to let it see. The Urantia Book affirms this slow, deliberate arc of justice. The delay in dealing with the Lucifer rebellion was not passivity. It was permission for the full consequences to play out before an audience of worlds. Evil was not allowed to flourish unchallenged. It was allowed to finish its sentence. The judgment, when it comes, is not a reaction. It is a revelation. It is the moment the fruit drops because it is ripe, not because it was forced. And this is the great mercy hidden in the delay. No being will ever be able to say they were silenced before they were seen. Every thought will have been expressed, every path tried, every deception unveiled by its own collapse. No soul will fall into the abyss blindly. They will walk there by choice and know it. And even then, the gates of return will remain open if the will to return is born. What we call justice, God calls healing, not because he ignores the wound, but because he aims deeper than punishment. He does not merely erase evil. He rewrites the story in such a way that the wound becomes wisdom, that the broken becomes whole without revenge, that those who once caused darkness become, if they choose, instruments of light, not because they deserve it, but because love does not operate on merit. It operates on truth. And the greatest truth is this: God is not slow. He is eternal, and eternity does not panic. If the cosmos were a wound opened by the rebellion, then Christ is the healing breath that entered it. He is not merely the answer to sin, nor simply the correction of error. He is the embodiment of the divine's unyielding presence within the story itself. The rebellion had shouted its defiance into the heavens, but heaven answered not with thunder, nor with force, but with incarnation. The choice of Christ to descend, not as a warrior, but as a child, is the reversal of every expectation. In a universe fractured by pride, he arrives in humility. In a world consumed by hierarchy, he comes in obscurity. Where Lucifer exalted the self and demanded sovereignty, Christ empties himself, taking the form of a servant. This was not weakness. It was the greatest strength, to enter darkness not to destroy it, but to illuminate it from within. The desert is where this illumination begins to confront the ancient echo. Before his public ministry, before the miracles and the crowds, there is a silence, a vast, dry silence. 40 days of emptiness, hunger, and confrontation, not with a demon of flames, but with the architecture of the ego. The temptations Christ faces are not arbitrary tests. They're the same seductions that twisted the heart of Lucifer. The hunger for power, the manipulation of divine law, the desire to be adored. But where the fallen one grasped, Christ releases. Where the rebel exalted himself, the Son bows to the Father. He does not argue, he abides. He does not perform, he remains rooted. And in doing so, he reestablishes the authority of truth, not by proclamation, but by embodiment. The victory in the desert is not spectacle. It is sovereignty reclaimed through silence, simplicity, and surrender. The Urantia Book gives us a broader lens through which to view this moment. Jesus of Nazareth is not only a teacher or savior of one world. He is Michael of Nebadon, a creator's son completing the final act of identification with his own creation. The incarnation on Urantia was not merely for humanity's redemption, but for the settling of a universal question. Can divine authority coexist with absolute freedom and perfect love? Lucifer had claimed that the Father's will was oppressive, that creatures should rule themselves, and that divine loyalty was slavery. Christ came not to debate those claims, but to dissolve them, not with force, but with fidelity. In every act of mercy, in every moment of patience, in every refusal to dominate, he lived the answer. And that answer burned deeper than any decree. Love is not weakness. Surrender is not loss. Divine will is not tyranny, but truth harmonized. And so the cross becomes inevitable, not as punishment, but as the endpoint of a life lived in radical coherence with the divine. The rebellion ends not with war, but with a man refusing to hate as he is murdered. The cosmos watches as the worst of human and celestial cruelty is poured out and meets no retaliation. Only love, only forgiveness. And in that unbearable stillness, the universe shifts. The cross is not a symbol of defeat. It is the axis upon which the old world collapses and a new one begins. At that intersection of vertical divinity and horizontal humanity, something happens that no system of thought, no theology, no cosmic tribunal could fully anticipate. The Eternal enters suffering not as judge, but as participant, and in doing so, changes the meaning of suffering itself. Before the cross, pain was often seen as punishment. After it, pain became a possible portal, a place where even God had walked. The rebel systems of the cosmos had asserted that autonomy would bring glory. But the crucified Son reveals that glory is not found in separation, but in communion, in remaining aligned with the source. Even unto death, Jesus rewrites the narrative of power. He does not seize dominion. He inherits it through absolute fidelity to love. The Urantia Book describes the crucifixion not merely as an event on one planet, but as the culmination of Michael's bestowal missions, the final and supreme revelation of divine character to the entire local universe of Nebadon. The choice to endure misunderstanding, rejection, violence, and spiritual agony without resorting to divine force was not a loss of control. It was the highest expression of divine control, the power to restrain, to remain faithful, to forgive. In doing so, Michael silences the rebellion, not by eradicating the rebels, but by exposing the bankruptcy of their ideology. The Lucifer Manifesto collapsed, not because it was argued against, but because the life and death of Christ rendered it obsolete. The universe had seen the difference between self-will and divine will played out in living color. The contrast was complete. The choice now was clear. This is why the resurrection is not merely a miracle. It is a vindication, not a reversal of death, but the proof that death has no dominion over love. The empty tomb is not just a declaration of victory. It is the dawn of a new cosmology, one in which love, humility, and obedience are not burdens, but portals. One in which darkness cannot win, not because it is vanquished by force, but because it cannot endure in the presence of truth. The figure of Christ, therefore, stands not only at the center of one religion, but at the turning point of cosmic history. He is not a myth. He is not a symbol. He is the event through which all rebellion is answered, all false power unmasked, all distortion undone. And his presence lingers, not in temples of stone, but in hearts that choose love over pride, forgiveness over vengeance, surrender over control. In every soul who echoes his words, "Not my will, but yours be done," the rebellion is quieted once more. In every choice to love when hate would be easier, to forgive when justice screams, to serve when the ego demands glory, the cross is lifted again, not as burden, but as bridge. The word judgment often arrives in the soul like thunder, heavy, ominous, final. It evokes the image of a great cosmic tribunal, a day of reckoning, of division, of punishment. But what if judgment is not the thunder of wrath, but the unveiling of truth? Not a sentence pronounced by an external deity, but a moment of luminous clarity in which all things are seen as they truly are. To judge is not merely to condemn, it is to illuminate. And the final judgment in the divine economy is not an arbitrary sorting of souls, but the consummation of a long unveiling. The moment when veils are lifted, masks fall away, and the soul stands before the mirror of being, seeing not a stranger, but its eternal self. In this light, the question is not when the judgment will come, but how we are preparing to behold ourselves. Time, in this sense, is mercy stretched wide, a grace that allows our illusions to dissolve gradually so we might not be crushed by the sudden brilliance of truth. The Urantia Book speaks of a judgment that is process, not panic, successive dispensations, administrative reviews, soul evaluations within the loving arms of an evolving universe. Each soul is given not just a chance to believe, but to become. Jacob Boehme, the mystic shoemaker of Gorlitz, envisioned judgment not as destruction, but as reintegration. For him, the soul that wandered into separation does not meet a sword, but a fire, a purifying presence that burns not to destroy, but to reunite the fragmented being with its divine essence. Judgment, in this sense, is the end of illusion. It is the death of deception, not the death of the soul. And in the wisdom of the early church mystics, voices like Gregory of Nyssa, we find the bold and ancient hope of apokatastasis, that all beings, even the most distant, will eventually return to the source. Not because God is lenient, but because God is relentless in mercy. The fire of divine justice is not fueled by rage, but by love that refuses to let anything truly created be eternally lost. In this vision, hell is not eternal torture, but temporal purification, a necessary passage, not a final state. And so the final judgment becomes not a closing, but an opening. Not a door slammed shut, but a gate flung wide. It is the beginning of the age where masks are no longer needed, where division collapses into unity, where even the fallen are given the choice, not the obligation, to return. The cosmos, once fractured, sings again in one voice. What, then, shall we say of those who resist the light, who flee from the face that is pure love? Here lies the tenderness and terror of freedom. That love cannot be forced, not even by God. The gates of restoration remain open, but no soul is dragged through them. Judgment, in its deepest form, is the soul's recognition of what it has always been choosing. And yet, the mystics insist, even those choices are not fixed eternally. Gregory of Nyssa envisioned a cosmos so suffused with divine presence that even the hardened heart, given infinite time, would soften. That beyond the veil of temporal existence, behind the curtains of dimension and mortality, there exists a pulse, patient and persistent, that calls every prodigal home. In that vision, the cry of Christ, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," echoes not just through time, but through eternity. This is not cheap grace. It is costly mercy. For the path back is not without fire, but it is a fire that clarifies rather than consumes. The book of Urantia echoes this, showing us dispensational judgments that serve not to annihilate, but to advance, to refine, to invite. Each judgment is not a sentence, but a summons. And in each, the divine invitation is extended once more. Choose life. Choose light. Choose home. Even Lucifer, the great rebel, is not outside this possibility. While his choices have collapsed systems and seeded sorrows across the stars, even he remains a being of origin, not of pure evil, but of distorted longing. Should the day come when the distortion breaks and the longing returns to its source, will the gates still stand open? The mystics would say yes. Not because rebellion is excused, but because love never revokes the invitation. In this grand vision, the cosmos is not a battlefield of winners and losers, saints and damned. It is a school, a garden, a symphony in which some notes have gone dissonant. And yet the composer continues, weaving even the broken sounds into resolution. The end, then, is not finality but harmony restored. Not judgment as verdict, but judgment as healing clarity. And that clarity brings reunion. And when that day comes, if it comes, when even the farthest soul turns its face back toward the light, what then? Will God rejoice, or will God weep? Perhaps both, the tears of a parent whose child has finally come home, not by force, but by choice. Thus, the final judgment is not the end of the story. It is the end of forgetting, the end of exile, The moment when the long night of separation gives way to morning, and all that was scattered is gathered again. From ashes, galaxies. From silence, song. From judgment, restoration. And perhaps that is the greatest secret of all, that the final word of the universe is not condemnation, but return. In the quiet halls of the East, beneath the whispering Bodhi trees and the murmured mantras of mountain monasteries, a different question has long been asked. Not, why does evil exist, but rather, what is it that perceives evil as real? Here the axis shifts. The cry of pain is not dismissed, but it is seen through a different lens, not as a cosmic rebellion, but as a symptom of misperception. To the Buddha, the root of suffering was not sin but ignorance, avidya, not an offense against divine law, but a veiling of the truth. We suffer because we cling to the illusion of permanence, to the illusion of self, to the illusion of separation. Evil, in this view, is not a substance but a shadow cast by a mind that does not yet see. The world is not condemned, it is misunderstood. And so the path is not punishment but awakening. The Noble Eightfold Path is not a penitential crawl toward divine favor, but a gentle unraveling of illusion. To see rightly is to live rightly. To wake from a dream of ego is to cease to harm, not by decree, but by recognition. The self that would wound others is seen for what it is, a mirage. Compassion arises not from command, but from clarity. In Vedanta, too, the world is Maya, not false in the sense of worthless, but transient, impermanent, dancing. What we call evil is the result of mistaking the dance for the dancer, the wave for the sea. Brahman, the ultimate reality, is all that truly is. And all that is not Brahman, fear, hatred, craving, is a forgetting of that truth. There is no enemy, only estrangement. No demon, only distortion. Evil, then, is not a force to be battled, but a veil to be lifted. These teachings do not negate suffering. They transfigure it. For if the self is not what it seems, then neither are its wounds final. The pain remains, but its meaning is changed. What once seemed an affront becomes an invitation to see deeper, to go beyond form, to recognize the divine not just in the temple, but in the tear and the silence, in the moment when illusion dissolves and only presence remains. If all is Brahman, then who suffers and what is it that wounds? The sages of the East do not answer with doctrine, but with silence. A silence that contains not absence, but fullness. In the Advaita tradition, non-duality is not a theory, but an unveiling. The dualities of good and evil, light and dark, self and other, are not ultimate truths. They're thresholds. They exist within the dream, but dissolve in the awakened eye. When the seer, the seen, and the act of seeing become one, there is no room left for hatred. There is only presence. There is only that. This vision resonates, subtly but profoundly, with the intuitions of early Christian gnosis. For the Gnostic, evil is not the equal counterpart of good, but a misalignment of forgetting. The cosmos itself was seen as having fallen into distortion, into layers of density that obscured the light. The task of the soul was not simply to obey, but to remember, to awaken, to ascend, not by effort, but by remembrance of its divine origin. In this frame, evil is not a rival power, but the byproduct of disconnection, the illusion that one could exist apart from the source. The Urantia Book, in its vast architecture of cosmology, brings a similar insight. The rebellion of Lucifer is portrayed not as a diabolical force of darkness, but as a philosophical error, a misjudgment of reality. His crime was not raw malice, but the assertion of independence from a unity that cannot, in truth, be severed. Separation, as Urantia teaches, is not real. It is permitted for a time, but ultimately unsustainable. The entire arc of time and space bends toward reunion. And so, the wisdom of East and West begins to whisper the same secret. Evil is not eternal. It is a fog, not a fortress. A lapse, not a law. The more deeply one sees, the more clearly one understands that all apparent opposites are held within a single, undivided reality. The war between light and shadow is not a war of equals. It is the dance of the one playing in the garments of the many. This is not to say that pain is imaginary. Far from it. The wound bleeds. The cry is real. But in the vision of the sages, the wound is not the final word. Beneath it pulses the eternal. Around it sings the unbroken field of unity. What we call evil may, in the end, be the fever of a world in healing, the thrashing of a soul on the edge of awakening. And perhaps this is the mercy hidden in the illusion, that the very thing which terrifies us may be the very path by which we remember who we truly are. Not scattered, not fallen, not doomed, but dreaming and slowly beginning to wake. The human being is not merely a product of biology or fate. It is the trembling intersection of eternity and time. Between stars and soil, between spirit and matter, we stand not as passive spectators, but as conscious thresholds. To be human is to live in tension, to feel the pull of transcendence and the drag of forgetfulness, to host both the hymn of the heavens and the murmur of dust within the same breath. Each day, whether in silence or noise, we are invited to choose. Not once, not twice, but constantly, in thought, in intention, in presence. The great illusion is that choice belongs only to grand moments. But it is the subtle, nearly invisible decisions, the way we respond to a stranger, the narratives we feed in our minds, the willingness to pause before reaction, that shape the soul's architecture. The Urantia Book paints the human being as the pivot of moral evolution, endowed with the dignity of free will, not as a toy of the gods or a slave of karma, but as a sovereign participant in the unfolding of meaning. The divine does not coerce, it waits. It invites, it surrounds, but does not override. In this lies both the glory and the burden of consciousness. We are not compelled to become. We are summoned to choose becoming. And the field upon which this sacred tension plays out is not abstract, it is the ordinary. In the warmth or coldness of a glance, in the decision to forgive or to harden, in the discipline of thought and the openness of heart. Every act becomes a prayer or forgetting. Every breath, a doorway to deeper presence or to numb dissociation. To walk this path requires a maturity that is not age, but depth. Spiritual adulthood is not measured in practices or philosophies, but in the willingness to hold complexity, to admit shadow without surrendering to it, to glimpse the divine without arrogance. The true warrior of light is not the one who destroys darkness, but the one who integrates it, who sees in the struggle not punishment, but initiation. We are beings born between realms. And because of that, we are asked not simply to choose sides, but to harmonize opposites, to become instruments through which heaven can touch the earth, and through which the cries of earth can ascend to heaven, transfigured. It is a profound responsibility to carry within oneself the axis of choice. We are not only creatures reacting to stimuli. We are creators of response, sculptors of meaning, priests of our own inner temples. The divine has entrusted to the human soul the terrifying and luminous gift of volition. And in this sacred autonomy lies the seed of both glory and devastation. For choice does not only elevate, it also wounds. But even our wounds can be woven into wisdom if brought into the light with humility. To choose well is not to choose perfectly, but to choose consciously. It is to bring presence to the moment instead of sleepwalking through it. True spiritual maturity is not in the certainty of beliefs, but in the consistency of returning to awareness after forgetting, to compassion after reaction, to alignment after drifting. We are not judged for falling. We are shaped by the direction in which we rise. In this light, sin becomes not merely a transgression, but a misalignment, a step out of harmony with the deeper current of being. And repentance, then, is not groveling before wrath, but the joyful recognition that one can begin again. The teachings of Urantia emphasize this deeply, that God is not offended by our stumbling, but is eternally engaged in the uplift of the willing. Choice, even when it falters, remains sacred, for it is the mirror through which the soul comes to know itself. Each moment becomes a fulcrum. A whisper of thought can ripple through the fabric of our lives. A single word, spoken or withheld, can open or close a heart. In this sacred arena of daily existence, we are not merely surviving. We are participating in a cosmic choreography of becoming. Light and shadow do not fight within us as enemies. They circle as dancers. And the one who chooses does not eliminate darkness, but illumines it with understanding. The greatest spiritual teachers across cultures and centuries have reminded us that heaven is not a place we go to, but a realm we learn to embody. The kingdom is within, and it is accessed not through dramatic gestures, but through the gentle, relentless practice of choosing the higher road, even when the lower path screams louder. Thus, to be human is not a limitation, it is a crossroads. We are the place where eternity bends toward time, where the infinite extends a hand through the finite. And in every choice, we either mirror that gesture or turn away. But even when we turn away, the hand remains. And perhaps that is the most humbling truth of all, that the one who gave us freedom also gave us endless chances to return. Beneath the shifting sands and sacred mountains of Iran lies a heartbeat that has never ceased. It pulses in silence, not always heard but always present, a rhythm older than empires, deeper than dogmas, woven into the spiritual DNA of humanity itself. Iran is not merely a nation. It is a threshold, a living archive of fire and revelation, of exile and return, of silence and song. Long before the maps of modern nations were drawn, long before names like East and West divided the world, there stood the fire temples of ancient Persia, altars without idols. Flames tended not to appease a deity, but to symbolize one. For Zarathustra, the prophet of light, did not teach of gods to be feared, but of a cosmic struggle to be illumined. His was a vision of duality, not as hopeless conflict, but as moral awakening. In every man and woman resided the choice between Asha, truth, and Druj, the lie. And that choice, lived sincerely, shaped the destiny of worlds. It is said that the Magi, those mysterious sages who traveled far to greet the Christ child, came from these lands. They carried not only gold, frankincense, and myrrh, they carried the echo of an older fire. Their pilgrimage was not merely geographic, it was spiritual convergence. In their steps, Zoroastrianism met messianic hope. East bowed toward west, and prophecy touched incarnation. Yet the Persian soul did not calcify in its ancient forms. It continued to breathe, sometimes gasping, sometimes singing, through the mystics who would come centuries later. Among them, the Sufis would emerge not as rebels to religion, but as its heart exposed. They spoke of a God not above, but within, not distant, but dancing. To them, pain was not the enemy of love, it was its proof. Rumi, born in the soil of Khorasan, whispered that the wound is where the light enters. And so the agony of exile became the intimacy of union. The desert became a garden, the loss a doorway. This mystical current did not flow in isolation. Its fragrance drifted westward, mingling with the Psalms of David, the lamentations of Job, and the visions of prophets. In every sacred text of the Abrahamic lineage, from the Torah to the Gospels, we hear faint echoes of the East. The wisdom of Persia shaped the contours of apocalyptic hope, the dream of angels, and the fire that does not consume. Even in the Urantia Book, Iran is not overlooked. It is the cradle of significant epics, the birthplace of key revelations, a junction where celestial administration intervened in human evolution. And what then is Iran today? A nation torn, a land misunderstood, a people often judged by headlines rather than heritage. But beneath it all, beyond politics, beyond pain, it still burns. That same fire, tended by unseen hands, waits. Not for conquest, but for recognition. Not for war, but for remembrance. In the fragrant gardens of Shiraz and the dusty streets of Nishapur, a new language of spirit began to form. One that defied dogma and dared to make the heart the holiest of temples. The Sufis did not destroy religion, they set it ablaze. For them, love was not an attribute of God, it was his very being. To love was not to obey a command, but to be consumed, to dissolve like sugar in tea, until nothing remained but sweetness. And yet, this sweetness came with salt. The Sufi did not avoid pain. He danced with it. He kissed it on the forehead. For in suffering, the mystic found refinement, the polishing of the mirror of the heart. Hafiz laughed at the piety that refused to break. Rumi wept for the soul that did not shatter. In these songs, the divine was not a distant ruler, but the beloved, whose absence pierced more than presence could ever soothe. The agony of longing became the proof of closeness. This mystical theology, so deeply Persian in its soul, would find strange and beautiful resonances in texts far from its birthplace. The Bible speaks in its own tongue of exile and return, of wilderness and fire, of angels on ladders and prophets in caves. The book of Job, with its raw lament and eventual surrender, could sit beside a Sufi poem and feel at home. And in Urantia, too, we find this echo, not as poetry, but as cosmic structure. The Sufi's longing is mirrored in the soul's ascent through the universes, the hunger for the universal Father, the dance between time and eternity. Even the magisterial sun, as described in Urantia, seems carved from the same yearning. An emissary who descends into chaos, not to judge, but to illuminate. The Persian model is not one of conquest, but of fire-bearing, the Magi again, bearing light across thresholds of ignorance. The soul of Iran, then, is not bound to geography. It is a frequency, a tone within the human symphony that calls us to remember both sorrow and ecstasy as threads of the same divine tapestry. And so we ask, what is Iran in the eyes of eternity? It is a mirror, not polished but cracked. And in those cracks, the light bends in unexpected ways. It shows us that the war between light and shadow is not only fought in heavens or scriptures, but in the quiet battles of the heart. That love can be fierce, that beauty can bleed, that sometimes the most luminous truths arise from lands scorched by misunderstanding. Iran is more than its borders. It is the ache of the spirit to belong to something ancient and sacred. It is the echo of fire in the bones of humanity. And even when it is silenced, the silence sings. There is a silence that only comes after the detonation. It is not peace. It is not absence. It is a sacred stillness that hovers like smoke above the ruins, not only of cities, but of illusions. War, whether waged with weapons or words, with cancer or heartbreak, with betrayal or famine, has a strange ability to strip away all pretense. What remains when the walls fall is not just devastation. Sometimes it is revelation. In the depths of suffering, many report the same strange light, not a blinding flash from above, but a warmth from within, a presence in the void, a clarity in the dark. Near-death experiences are filled with such paradoxes. People who have hovered between breaths often return changed, as if a veil had been torn and something eternal glimpsed. They speak not of doctrines, but of light, not of punishment, but of love, not of the end, but of an invitation. This is the strange mercy of collapse. It humbles the mind, yes. It breaks the ego, yes. But more than that, it cracks open the architecture of falsehood and allows the soul to whisper through. Pain becomes the sound of the soul knocking from the inside. In the wreckage, something truer begins to speak. But not all awakenings come through miracles. Some arrive through exhaustion, through long nights where nothing makes sense anymore, through the slow crumbling of certainty. The human being, suspended between flesh and spirit, often requires the disruption of routine to remember its deeper origin. The mind forgets what the soul never stopped knowing. And so, through loss, through madness, through fire, we return to what was always true, that we are more than this moment. We are pilgrims of eternity, temporarily clothed in limitation. The Urantia Book frames the human experience as a kind of crucible, a place of tension, trial, and transformation. The world is not a prison. It is a proving ground, not in the punitive sense, but in the alchemical one. Through sorrow, through failure, through confrontation with evil, we become agents of understanding. Not because we conquer, but because we remember. And in this remembrance, we begin to see. The purpose was never to avoid pain, but to find the divine within it. Sometimes, the calling of the soul does not come as a whisper in meditation, but as a scream in crisis. It does not always arrive robed in serenity. Sometimes it wears the face of loss, of betrayal, of collapse. It knocks not on the monastery door, but on the burning house, on the hospital bed, on the moment you realize everything you believe no longer makes sense. And in that unraveling, what is essential begins to shine. This is the paradox that terrifies and liberates. The soul is often found not by climbing toward heaven, but by descending into hell with eyes open. The dark night of the soul, spoken of by mystics across ages, is not a punishment. It is a purification. In the alchemy of spirit, fire is not always destruction. Sometimes, it is the only thing hot enough to melt the chains forged by illusion. But how do we discern purpose in the pain? How do we know it's not just chaos laughing in our faces? The answer lies not in the intellect, but in presence. Purpose is not a map. It is a pulse. It is found in the decision to remain conscious within suffering, to not run, to not numb, to not harden. It is found in choosing to love while bleeding, in choosing to see while weeping, in choosing to rise even when nothing is guaranteed. In that moment, something shifts. The pain becomes luminous, not because it disappears, but because it becomes part of the awakening. In Urantia, the journey of the soul is described as an ascent, not simply vertical through the heavens, but inward, through layers of understanding and willingness. This planet, this life, this flesh is not a detour. It is the path. Earth is not a mistake to be escaped. It is a school, a temple, a battleground where spirit is carved out of experience. And every cry, every heartbreak, every confrontation with evil, these are not detours. They are invitations. We are not here to be spared from the war. We are here to awaken within it, to see, amid the rubble, the flicker of a deeper reality, to remember, even in the face of death, that we are eternal. That consciousness is not extinguished, it transforms. That nothing is wasted, not even the worst day of your life. The human experience, in all its frailty and fire, is not a curse. It is a preparation. It is where gods are born from dust. It is where the finite begins to stretch toward the infinite, and where the soul learns to sing, even in the smoke of ruins. There is a silence deeper than space, a stillness older than time. It is not void, it is presence. A presence that does not shout, does not impose, does not burn the sky to be known. It waits, not passively, but with infinite power folded into infinite patience. This is the heart of God, not a throne of lightning, but a cradle of light. Not a gavel, but a pulse that has never missed a beat, even when creation trembled. Love is not an attribute of this heart. It is its essence. From the smallest photon to the vastest galaxy, all that exists swims in this love, even when unaware. It is the sustaining breath, the unseen rhythm that holds atoms together and gives stars their fire. It is not sentimental. It is not weak. It is the most formidable force in the cosmos. Not because it controls, but because it endures. Even betrayal, even rebellion, even death, the fall of angels, of mortals, of civilizations, is not unknown to this heart, nor is it unexpected. It is folded into the story, like shadow into painting, like silence into music. The parable of the prodigal son is not a myth to entertain children. It is the architecture of reality. Every soul, luminous or lost, is written into that parable. The wanderer, the rebel, the one who squandered their inheritance in distant lands of illusion, all are seen, and all are awaited. God does not panic. The Father does not seal the door. He does not send soldiers or thunder or fire to drag the sun back. He waits at the edge of the road, every day, scanning the horizon with eyes that have never closed. And when the soul returns, limping, broken, unsure, the embrace is not conditional. There is no interrogation, no tally of sins. There is only joy, because the return, not the fall, is the point. Because the reunion, not the punishment, is the victory. This love is scandalous to the mind. It offends logic. It dismisses economy. It is wildly, recklessly generous. In Urantia, we are told that even Lucifer, in the vast corridors of eternity, will be given the opportunity to return. Not because evil is excused, but because love is greater. Because the universal Father is not a warden, but a weaver, and even the threads of darkness can be woven into light. The fall is not the end. It is a turning point, not the climax of a story, but the bend in the road that makes return possible. All across the cosmos, there are echoes of this mystery. The mythologies of rebirth, the sacred rhythms of death and resurrection, the tales of gods who descend in a shadow only to rise bearing light. These are not merely cultural artifacts. They are reflections, imperfect, yes, but sincere, of a truth inscribed into the fabric of existence, that love loses no one. Not forever, Even those who have plummeted from the highest heights, from thrones of light to pits of rebellion, are not erased. They are remembered. They are missed. In the Urantia teachings, the figure of Lucifer is not annihilated but awaited. The door remains open. The universe is not interested in erasing evil by force, but in reclaiming the lost by choice. Redemption is not imposed. It is offered. Always. Eternally. Patiently. And what of those who have suffered at the hands of that rebellion? What of the pain, the injustice, the long centuries of distortion? Are they forgotten in this cosmic mercy? No, they are not bypassed. They are crowned. For in their endurance, in their trust amid silence, in their refusal to become bitter, they reflect the very heart of God. The justice of eternity is not retribution, but restoration. Not vengeance, but transfiguration. And every tear will become seed. Every scar will become star. The victory of love is not loud. It does not march with banners. It does not crush its enemies. It simply outlasts them. It waits until every heart has had its chance to awaken. It weaves with infinite precision every thread, even the dark ones, into something beautiful, into something whole. And in the end, when all prodigals have returned, when even the furthest sparks have remembered their flame, there will be no cries for punishment. Only awe, only joy, only light. This is the secret at the center of everything. The cosmos is not governed by wrath, but by welcome, not by law, but by longing. The Father is not counting sins. He is counting steps, and every step toward home, no matter how late, is celebrated. For this is not a universe of abandonment. It is a universe of return, of redemption, of unimaginable, undefeatable love. We have walked through shadows and revelations, through the abyss and the stars. We have touched the pain of exile and the pulse of eternity. Now, as we approach the threshold of silence again, that divine stillness from which all arises, we pause to gather the threads. For what has been unveiled is not merely knowledge, but remembrance. Not doctrine, but presence. Not argument, but invitation. The entire cosmos, with its spiraling galaxies and trembling hearts, echoes one truth. Freedom is sacred, but not the hollow freedom to abandon, to sever, to destroy. Rather, the luminous freedom to choose love even when there is every reason not to. The freedom to return, to say yes again. This is the redemptive power that moves the stars and opens the gates of the soul. Not obedience by fear, but devotion by awakening. In this freedom lies the justice of God. Not the justice of punishment, but the justice of wholeness. A justice that sees the full story, that knows every motive, every wound, every forgotten prayer. A justice that is never blind, but infinitely merciful. And because of this, we can trust, not naively, but deeply. Trust that no suffering is unseen, no act of love is wasted, no fall is final. The divine patience is not indifference, it is confidence. A confidence in us, in the process, in the eventual and inevitable return of all things to light. Hope, then, is not a fragile wish. It is a certainty written into the architecture of reality. Redemption is not an exception, it is the design. The universe is not spiraling toward chaos, but toward coherence, toward remembrance, toward reunion. And that hope is not something we hold like a fragile candle in the storm. It is something that holds us even when we forget how to breathe. To live in this awareness is to surrender, not to weakness, but to truth, not to passivity, but to presence, to lay down the arms of ego and stand naked in the mystery, whispering yes. Yes to love that cannot be controlled. Yes to a path that unfolds only as we walk it. Yes to a God who waits, who walks, who weeps, who rejoices. To surrender, truly, is not to disappear. It is to become radiant. It is to let go of the illusion of control and remember that we are not separate drops, but part of the ocean dreaming itself into form. The teachings, the myths, the revelations, from Urantia to the Vedas, from the cross to the fire of Zoroaster, are all lenses through which the infinite gazes back at itself. All rivers returning to the same ocean. All songs whispering the same name. We are not called to perfection. We are called to truth. And truth, when seen clearly, is love. Unguarded, unmeasured, unending. A love that redeems not by decree, but by presence. A love that does not erase the past, but transfigures it. That does not force the door, but stands at the threshold with open arms. This is the final invitation. To trust the rhythm of a universe that redeems. To walk not by fear, but by surrender. To understand that redemption is not merely an idea. It is a rhythm that pulses through every sunrise, every act of forgiveness, every tear that falls and waters the soul. You're not lost. You're becoming. And now that you have seen the light behind the shadows, the sacred beneath the chaos, the heart within the silence, return to your life not as you were, but as you are, a bearer of flame, a voice of mercy, a spark of the very love that holds the cosmos. Nothing is wasted, nothing is forgotten, and in the end, all that was scattered shall be gathered, all that was broken shall shine, and all that was fallen shall rise. Welcome home, and if you enjoyed this content, please leave a comment where you're from, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to the channel. It's very important to us. Every day we bring new videos to nourish the soul.